Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Omnia Performance Podcast. Today, you've got me, Kieran, and I'm going to be talking you through loaded marching or load carriage. I'm going to talk about how it's relevant to military or tactical professionals, the everyday athlete going out on adventures, and perhaps even some trail ultramarathon type clients. So let's get straight into it. First, we'll talk about what load carriage actually is. And for the purposes of this podcast, because there's plenty of ways we can define this, we're going to keep it really simple. We're just going to assume that load carriage means we're carrying some kind of additional kit or equipment, usually through a backpack, belt gear, or perhaps on the chest. And it's usually part of your sport or your job. And we're going to keep it really simple. That's all we're going to define it as. Now, different groups are going to be carrying different loads, and we're going to touch on why that's important. But broadly, let's call it carrying an additional 10 kilograms plus. Now, there's three main groups that this will apply to. The first is tactical professionals, so soldiers and any military personnel being the key and obvious one. You've got law enforcement and rescue services who often carry lots of equipment, have to do very demanding tasks in it as well. So we're going to group all of those together as tactical professionals. We've then got adventure athletes, so people pushing hard out in the mountains, or perhaps just those going out on long hikes or long expeditions, multi-day trekking, that kind of thing. And that's, of course, highly relevant to the Omnia community. Many of you love getting out into the hills and just want to be able to perform well up there. And then we've got a kind of pseudo category where certain unsupported ultramarathons, particularly those up in the hills with large mandatory kit lists, for example, they may start to venture into this realm of true load carriage, particularly if you're carrying, as I said, sort of more than, we'll call it about 10 kilograms. So how do we actually train for the demands of these kind of tasks? Well, luckily, we have some well-evidenced recommendations, and we've seen this both in my own career in the military and coaching a huge number of military athletes, but across the spectrum of professions. A lot of the studies that we'll talk about, they've come from perhaps specialist police, both soldiers, fire brigade, for example. There's all sorts of groups that have been studied. So these are very well evidenced recommendations. The first is that we want what's called a concurrent training approach. We want to be training both strength and endurance. And that might be heresy to some of the old and the bold who perhaps in their day, very old school methods resulted in people who were very aerobically fit. All they would do was run and tab or loaded march. But they didn't do much strength training. Perhaps the only sort of resistance training came from circuits and bodyweight movements, for example. And that led to soldiers or professionals who were very aerobically fit, but underprepared for the demands of modern loads that they had to carry. And in modern years or recent years, we've seen the opposite happen. We've seen the needle swing too far in the opposite direction, particularly with the explosion of CrossFit in the military scene, for example. And now we're seeing soldiers who are strong, perhaps they spend a lot of time in the gym, but they're not aerobically fit enough for the demands of the tasks they're taking on. So we need to be focusing on both. Contrary to what many people believe, aerobic fitness is of far greater importance than many would have you believe. Certain groups would now push that strength training is all that you need to do, and it's simply not the case. We've got a great paper that looked at specialist police carrying 25 kilograms, so very relevant loads to modern fighting loads of a soldier, perhaps once they've put their main insertion kit down, so very relevant to the military environment. And this study found that the most important predictor of somebody's loaded march performance was their running ability, specifically the 2K run. And quite frankly, to anybody currently serving, particularly those who have really pushed the needle on load carriage, it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. We all know the people who are strong in the gym but can't keep up once load marches go past a certain duration. Vice versa, we also know people who might be, your cross-country kings, but they get folded in half once loads get heavy enough. I've personally found that 25 kilogram mark to be quite a good inflection point. Below that, particularly on courses like P Company, where you might be carrying less load than that, aerobic fitness is by far and away the biggest predictor. Past that 25 kilogram mark, strength starts to become much more of a factor, and some of the lighter lads, or certainly those who are weaker, are going to struggle. And that's where strength training becomes very, very important. In terms of frequency, we also have good evidence here. So the majority of narrative reviews have the recommendation that we should be including loaded march training for those who need it as part of their job. So I'm referring to military or tactical professionals specifically here. every 7 to 14 days. Any less than that, and you risk not having the resilience needed should you have to perform these tasks at the drop of a hat, which, of course, in an uncertain world is very important for tactical professionals. And every 7 to 14 days is enough of a stimulus that you can have adequate recovery, reduce your injury risk, but still have a very solid training effect. Now, the caveat to this, particularly for those going for some of the more arduous courses, I will often build people up to training loaded marching more often than that, but that's a good general recommendation. For those that are going on more intense courses, often at first we'll build them up to being able to handle loaded marching every week, and then multiple times a week in the later stages of prep once they've built a really solid base of conditioning. But rough recommendations, every 7 to 14 days for general conditioning, and that gives you a good base to ramp things up should you need to for more specific prep courses. In terms of the strength training that we actually take on, it should surprise nobody to find out that lower body strength and power are absolutely key when it comes to load carriage. There's a very strong link between squat strength and vertical jump and your loaded march performance, and therefore our programming should reflect that. We should be including a lot of lower body strength and power through plyometrics, jumps, solid strength training, and in particular, exercises such as split squats or step downs are very helpful for managing the braking forces that we get when we're running downhill under load, for example. Another thing that I really like my athletes to be very prepared in are lateral movements, things like lateral lunges, plyometrics, moving left and right rather than just up and down. And they help build this base of resilience so that should you take a misstep out on the hill, perhaps you're climbing a steep incline and your feet slide out from underneath you and you put a leg out to stabilize yourself. What we don't want is those uncertain situations to force you into a range of motion that you're not comfortable in, that you haven't built up a good amount of strength. And that's where some of this solid lateral training becomes very, very important. It just reduces the likelihood that any position you might find yourself in is one that you're not ready for. Now, this is an element that perhaps is a little bit more contentious, particularly when you bring it up in a lot of units. They think it's pointless, and that's upper body strength training. And often, particularly in serving military, we relegate upper body strength training to just some push-ups or pull-ups, for example. But we've got a very solid amount of evidence that loaded marching places a very significant demand on the spinal extensors, the abdominal muscles, hip flexors, and just general upper body demands, and strengthening those movement patterns is very, very important. Now, one of the things that is perhaps hypothesized why this might be the case is that those muscles help support posture under load and they help support proper breathing mechanics. Now, this is something that I've pushed for a very long time, regardless of the mechanism behind it, because in my view, the primary way that we interact with the world and the main way that we express our force and our strength into an object that we have to lift or a person we have to control, for example, is through our hands and our body. So regardless of whether there is or isn't a benefit to loaded marching, I personally have always pushed that soldiers and law enforcement should take upper body training very seriously. And it helps explain why some of the athletes that I train have had such strong results. Many have been very surprised at the benefit it's had on, for example, their weighted pull-ups to their 2-miler time, for example, just a loose correlation. But many people have been very surprised to find out just how helpful that upper body strength training has been. Now, another point is the injury mitigation. So particularly if you're serving, we all know people who have overdone loaded marching. Perhaps they've turned up to basic training unprepared, or perhaps they've taken on a course, or they've gone on a march that was particularly long and they were underprepared for it, for example. So very, very common in the military, and they're usually associated with inappropriate progression or big jumps in volume or the specific distance of one particular run, weighted run, loaded march, whatever the cause may be. To combat this, in our own training, we want to be as systematic and cautious with increasing volume as we can be. But we also want to balance that with being adequately prepared for the demands of any course that we might be training for. So very often what I see, particularly when I was still serving, in terms of people who failed these courses or got injured, often they were so scared of injury in training that they did a huge amount of low impact training, loads of time on the bike or the cross trainer, and that's all great training volume. But because they weren't doing enough actual impact, funnily enough, when it came time for these high impact courses, they weren't conditioned to the demands of that task. And something that I like to slightly tongue-in-cheek remind people is that, yes, there's a place for it, but ultimately you cannot train for a high impact course with low impact training. You need to be building yourself up gradually over a long enough period of time so that you can build resilience in the smaller muscle groups and tendons, ligaments, bones, all of those supporting structures, so that you don't get hurt in training itself, or when you come onto the course, so that that course doesn't represent a very big jump compared to your training previously. And unfortunately, I see this quite often with people whose primary sport, perhaps prior to joining the military or while serving, if people's sport was non-impact related, so cyclists or swimmers, very often they lack the resilience needed to handle that high impact, and often it holds them back. So one of the first priorities I do with these athletes when I'm working with them is to bring their running up to scratch. As we've touched on, your running is one of your strongest predictors of loaded march performance, and it's one of the single easiest ways that we can dose impact in our training. So as I've said, if we're only going to loaded march for, say, once every 7 to 14 days, well, the rest of our conditioning, a good amount of that, we want that to be running if we're going to be expecting ourselves to perform well in a high impact task. And then we can sprinkle in some low impact conditioning, such as, say, swimming or biking, for example. But we want the core of our training to be running in most cases, so that we are prepared for that demands. And one sort of related aspect to that, and I refer to this as essentially playing your sport, and that's the importance of getting out in the hills or out on rough terrain at the very least, particularly for military, for those who are going out on, say, adventurous expeditions, or if your sport is something like fell running or mountaineering or anything of that type. If we want to be able to perform on rough terrain, then you need to train for it. And there is a massive, massive difference to being able to move fast under load on concrete, like many of our tests will be done, versus actually being able to move fast over rough ground, where realistically that's where it matters, because that's where the job is actually performed. Being able to do so requires a level of coordination, skill, and essentially trust in your step that you can. We've all seen it, people who are like Bambi trying to cross rough ground because they've not done it before. And being able to have that confidence that you're not going to slip, that you know where you can place your feet, that comes particularly, for example, something like running downhill fast under load over rough terrain. That only comes with time and practice. And I saw this time and time again in my own military career, where those of us who spent a lot of time in the mountains, loved our mountaineering, for example, and particularly those of us who grew up quite outdoorsy, we found loaded marching over rough terrain so much easier than those who didn't get outside much, perhaps who only ever trained around camp or hadn't had much of a background in mountaineering. It makes such a difference when it comes to it out on the rough terrain. Another aspect where that's particularly helpful is in injury resilience. So you think about when you're placing your foot over rough terrain, you get lots of little micro rolls of the ankle. You're building resilience to not being in this perfect, optimally stacked position. And you're reducing the likelihood that this slight misstep takes you out of a range that you're comfortable in. And we see this quite often. And I'm sure anybody who's been up in the mountains a lot, you can probably relate to this. I've had a number of cases where I've gone over on my ankle and I've been able to run it off absolutely fine. And once the initial shock of it's gone, you're like, oh, actually, you know what? I really haven't done anything there. I'm good to go. And a huge amount of that has come from just these slight micro rolls, as I like to call them, just slowly building up the resilience in my ankles to be able to handle that kind of movement. And that doesn't come from anything other than getting your reps in over rough terrain and, as I put it, playing your sport. It's very, very important. With that kind of training, it takes time to build resilience in all of those supporting structures. So this can't be rushed. And this is why I stand by the fact that mountaineering is the most specific hobby a soldier could have, even if it's just getting up in the hills on the weekends, going out, navigating, orienteering, fell running, whatever it is. Just spending time on rough terrain, doing aspects that simulate your job are so, so helpful. It's particularly important for people who are going on to things like adventurous trail ultramarathons or trail races, fell races, anything of that nature where you're moving fast, particularly if you're going to have up and downhill. So moving downhill, we're placing a huge amount of force on the body. Lot of eccentric load makes your legs very, very sore. Anybody who's done a race with a lot of downhill will tell you it really, really blows up the quads. It's not just the impact factor, it's that braking force that you have to apply that becomes very, very taxing. Practicing in that terrain becomes very important for these kind of races. So for any of my athletes that are going on things like trail, half marathons, fell races, or anything of that nature, particularly unsupported, where they're going to be carrying a heavy weighted vest, perhaps they've got a lot of water or food with them, or their mandatory kit, where all of that extra load is just going to add to the stress that their body's feeling. I like those people to get out in the hills or the terrain they need to race over as often as they can, just to build up that resilience. And I like to sprinkle that in early because, as I said, this is a process that takes a long time. So don't rush it. Just as soon as you get these kind of events in the calendar, or you know that it's something that is going to be important for your job, just start sprinkling it in there. Weekends here and there all make a difference in terms of building up that confidence and having a solid base of resilience there. So there we have it, a nice short, sharp episode. And in summary, when it comes to carrying load, particularly heavier ones for a tactical occupation, we want to be training strength and endurance concurrently, and we don't want to allow one to overpower the other. We want to be training both the upper body and the lower body very hard, and both have importance, not just for the role, but also for load carriage itself. We want to be pushing our aerobic fitness hard, particularly through running, so that we are actually building our ability to tolerate that impact. We want to build up our volume carefully and over a long period of time so that you develop that resilience and tolerance in the bones, tendons, ligaments, and supporting structures, and you minimize the risk of overuse injuries that we all know are unfortunately far too common in the forces or tactical occupations. And then finally, we want to play our sport. We want to get out on the ground that we need to be able to work in. We want to move across it at pace, carrying load regularly. If you want to dive into any of the points that I've mentioned there in more detail, you can have a look at the reference for a TSAC report that's titled The Biomechanical Effects of Loaded Marching and Resulting Training Recommendations. And everything that I've mentioned there is very well supported in evidence. And there's many references there that you can dive into if you want some further reading. Finally, if you've got any big events or in particular military courses coming up and you want our expert guidance to make sure that you're prepared for them, we're currently taking on new one-to-one coaching clients, and you can inquire in the link down below in the caption wherever you're watching this and have a look at whether or not we can help with your goals. Until next time, thank you very much for listening.